The usual story sounds almost too perfect. Hungry wolves crept toward human camps. They ate scraps. The friendliest stayed. Over generations, they became dogs. It may be partly true, but the earliest evidence does not let us tell the story so neatly. Paleolithic hunter-gatherers were not settled villagers surrounded by permanent refuse heaps. Wolves were not harmless scavengers waiting to be adopted. They were intelligent pack hunters competing for many of the same animals humans needed to survive. And by the time unmistakable dogs appeared genetically across Western Eurasia, the transformation was already well underway. The first invitation, if there ever was one, has vanished. That changes the question. Instead of asking how humans tamed wolves, we may need to ask why either species allowed the other to remain close. Food may have narrowed the distance. Other advantages may have helped sustain it. But proximity also created danger, disease, competition, and the possibility of betrayal. So why did humans invite wolves into the Firelight? Perhaps they did not. Perhaps the dog began in the long, unstable border between tolerance and fear, where certain wolves learned to read humans, and certain humans discovered that the eyes beyond the flames could watch with them rather than against them. The first step toward a dog was probably not ownership. It was permission. A wolf appeared at the edge of a camp and was not driven away. Perhaps it returned the next night. Perhaps its offspring returned years later. No one needed to imagine a new animal or decide to domesticate a species. The earliest decision may have been smaller. Allow this one to remain closer than the others. Repeated across generations, that tolerance could change a population. Wolves that attacked, panicked, or kept their distance gained little from human camps. Those able to watch people without immediately fleeing or fighting could reach food and new opportunities. Humans could also learn which animals were predictable and which were dangerous. Long before selective breeding became deliberate, survival may already have been filtering the animals at the boundary. This began before farms, villages, or domesticated livestock. Genetically identified dogs were living among hunter-gatherers by at least about 15,800 years ago, and their separation from wolf ancestors must have started earlier. Yet no excavation has recovered the first shared meal, the first tolerated litter, or the first night a canid slept inside a human camp. That is why invitation is useful only as a metaphor. Dog domestication was not a doorway crossed once. It was a boundary moved repeatedly, sometimes by wolves approaching, and perhaps sometimes by humans bringing young animals closer. But tolerance alone is not an explanation. Why would mobile hunters accept a competitor that consumed meat, attracted danger, and could turn against them? To answer that, we have to begin with the simplest theory and then ask what it leaves out. The simplest explanation begins with hunger. After a successful hunt, people left behind bones, hide, connective tissue, and pieces of meat that were difficult or unnecessary to carry. Wolves could smell those remains from beyond the camp. The boldest approached first. The most aggressive risked being driven away or killed. The most fearful never came close enough to benefit. Between them was a narrow behavioral type, an animal cautious enough not to attack, but tolerant enough to wait. If those wolves found food more reliably near humans, they might survive and reproduce more often than wolves that avoided people entirely. If part of that reduced fear passed to their offspring, selection could gradually favor animals better able to watch human movement, control their reactions, and live at the edge of human activity. This is the commensal scavenging model, and it is powerful because it does not require anyone to plan domestication. The wolf begins the process simply by exploiting a new ecological niche. But the model becomes less comfortable when placed in the Paleolithic. These were not permanent farming villages producing the same waste in the same place every day. Many hunter-gatherer groups moved through landscapes, followed prey, and occupied camps seasonally. Wolves already scavenged from abandoned kills without becoming socially attached to the hunters who made them. They also competed with humans for prey, and could create danger around vulnerable people and stored meat. Most importantly, scraps can explain why an animal returns. They do not explain when humans began feeding particular individuals, raising young animals, protecting them, or taking them from one camp to another. The scavenging story may describe the first approach. It does not yet explain the first relationship. So how do we know that this unstable distance eventually produced animals that were no longer simply wolves? The next clue is not a collar, a footprint, or a hearth. It is a fragment of bone preserved on the central Anatolian plateau. At Pınarbaşı, in what is now Turkey, Archaeologists recovered canid remains from layers occupied by hunter-gatherers near the end of the Ice Age. For years, the bones could only suggest what the animal had been. A wolf? An unusually shaped canid? Something already moving toward the dog? Ancient DNA changed the question. Researchers generated both nuclear and mitochondrial genomes from one individual directly dated to about 15,800 years ago. Genetically, it grouped with dogs rather than wolves. Until this evidence was published, the earliest unequivocal nuclear genome from a dog was roughly 5,000 years younger. Punarbasha was only one end of the map. More than 3,000 kilometers to the northwest, at Gough's Cave in Britain, another canid lived about 14,300 years ago. Its genome also placed it among dogs. Even more revealing, the Punarbasha and Gough's Cave animals were more genetically similar to each other than either was to any other known dog in the comparison. Their shared maternal ancestry may reach back to a population living around 16,900 years ago. That creates a larger scene than a wolf lingering beside one camp. By the late Upper Paleolithic, related dogs were present from Anatolia to Western Europe among genetically and culturally distinct human groups, probably moving through networks of migration, contact, or exchange. The bones also carry quieter evidence of proximity. At Punarbasha, very young dogs were buried near human burials, and isotope results suggest an aquatic component in their diet, although they cannot tell us whether humans provided that food. At Gough's Cave, dogs and people had broadly comparable dietary signals, but isotopes alone cannot prove domestication or direct feeding. What can safely be said is narrower and more important. By at least 15,800 years ago, dogs were no longer confined to a hypothetical first encounter. They belonged to a population spread across Western Eurasia and closely associated with different hunter-gatherer societies. But if dogs were already traveling through human worlds, where are the creatures that stood between wolf and dog? Then the most beautiful story begins to fall apart. Long before the dogs from Punarbasha and Gough's Cave, Ice Age people left behind canid skulls that seemed to offer an earlier beginning. At Goyet Cave in Belgium, a large canid dated to roughly 34,000 years ago had a shortened, broadened skull that some researchers interpreted as dog-like. At Prehistoric in Czechia, canids from about 28,500 years ago appeared beside mammoth-hunting people, and differences in skull form and diet were read as signs that some animals occupied a special place near humans. Razboynica Cave in the Altai produced another candidate, about 33,000 years old, whose compact muzzle seemed difficult to fit inside the normal range of wolves. Together, these remains created an irresistible picture. Humans and early dogs finding each other near the height of the Ice Age, thousands of years earlier than the clearest accepted evidence. But a skull does not carry a name. Pleistocene wolves varied with climate, prey, geography, age, and sex. A canid eating different food from nearby wolves may have scavenged human kills or lived near people, but that does not automatically make it a dog. Most decisively, nuclear DNA recovered from several famous candidates, including Goyet, Predmosti, Razboynica, and Elisevici, placed them within wolf populations that later disappeared, not within the dog lineage known from later genomes. That does not make these animals unimportant. Some may still preserve failed experiments in proximity. Wolves that hunted near humans, fed on their remains, or were treated differently without founding a lasting domestic population. Domestication need not have advanced in a straight line. Human groups may have tolerated canids many times, in many places, while only one or a few relationships left descendants. The earliest apparent dog, then, may not be an ancestor at all. It may be evidence of how often the boundary was approached before it was permanently crossed. So, what allowed one lineage to survive that crossing and become valuable enough for humans to care for, even when it could offer little in return? The next clue is not older. It is more intimate. Near Bonn in western Germany, archaeologists uncovered a grave dating to roughly 14,000 years ago. Inside were the remains of 2 humans and a young dog. Detailed examination of its teeth suggests that it had suffered several severe episodes of illness, probably while only a few months old. The pattern is consistent with canine distemper, a dangerous viral disease that can cause fever, weakness, breathing problems, and neurological damage. A sick juvenile in that condition would have struggled to hunt, travel, or feed itself. Yet it survived for weeks. That survival matters because prolonged care carried a cost. Someone may have brought it food and water, kept it warm, cleaned it, or protected it while the group continued to move through a difficult Ice Age landscape. During much of that illness, the dog was unlikely to provide reliable help in hunting or defense. Whatever value it had was not limited to what it could do on that particular day. After death, its body was placed within the same burial context as the humans. It is tempting to call this love. It may have been. But archaeology cannot recover the exact emotions of the people who cared for the animal. The grave does not prove affection, religion, or belief in an afterlife. What it does show is investment. Time, food, protection, and attention given to a vulnerable dog that could offer little immediate return. Von Oberkassel does not reveal why wolves first approached human camps. It reveals something later and equally important. By this point, at least some dogs had crossed from ecological opportunity into social obligation. An animal once tolerated at the edge of human life could become a creature whose survival mattered to the group. But what made that crossing possible? Why could a wolf lineage enter the human social world when so many other predators remained outside it? The body created a problem no pile of scraps could solve. To live near humans, a wolf had to do more than tolerate their smell. It had to read movement, restrain aggression, remember individuals, and respond to signals from a species whose gestures were not its own. Wolves already possessed part of that machinery. They live in social groups, coordinate during hunts, defend territory, care for young, and adjust their behavior to the actions of others. Modern experiments show that wolves raised intensively around people can form individual bonds with human handlers and cooperate with familiar humans in demanding tasks. The capacity for partnership already existed. The missing difference was not capacity. It was preference. Even when wolf puppies receive extensive human contact, dog puppies are generally more attracted to people. They approach unfamiliar humans more readily, make more eye contact, and use human pointing gestures with less training. In one comparative study, dog puppies followed human gestures at levels far above chance, while the wolf puppies, despite receiving more intensive human socialization, were less likely to approach people or seek their attention. Domestication may therefore have altered motivation before it perfected skill. Selection did not have to create a new intelligence. It could favor animals whose existing social attention turned more easily toward humans, whose fear rose more slowly, and whose first response to uncertainty was to look rather than flee or attack. Across generations, it could transform the entire relationship. A canid able to monitor human faces, hands, and voices would be easier to feed, move, protect, and eventually trust. Still, social compatibility only made cooperation possible. It did not make another mouth cheap. What benefit could justify feeding a predator through an Ice Age winter? Winter makes every mouth visible. A hunting group has brought down a large animal. Steam rises from the opened carcass. The hunters have meat, but not all meat is equal. In cold environments, fat is precious. Human metabolism can process only so much protein safely. When prey is lean and fat is scarce, a carcass can contain more protein than people can use, even while they remain short of energy. For wolves, the calculation is different. They are better adapted to living on lean flesh for long periods. That difference has produced one possible explanation for the beginning of domestication. Ice Age hunters may sometimes have possessed meat they could not fully use, while nearby wolves could turn that surplus into survival. Imagine the decision in practical terms. A strip of lean meat is thrown beyond the sleeping area. The same animal returns the following night. It does not rush the fire. It waits. Over time, feeding becomes selective, not food for every wolf, but food for the individual least likely to attack, steal, or panic. This remains a hypothesis, not a recovered scene. No bone can tell us who threw the first piece, and not every hunt created a surplus. Seasons changed. Prey disappeared. Fat could matter more than meat. A group that fed a canid in autumn might have nothing to spare by late winter. And the cost extended beyond calories. A wolf near camp could bite, carry disease, attract rivals, disturb sleep, or compete for the same prey. Feeding it meant investing in an animal whose usefulness was uncertain. Yet, the very mismatch between human and wolf metabolism may have created a narrow opening. What people could not safely eat in unlimited amounts, wolves could use. Waste became leverage. Distance became routine. But food can keep an animal nearby. It cannot by itself make that animal part of the group. One plausible reconstruction begins when a returning animal stops being interchangeable. A wolf at the edge of camp is only a shape in the dark, but an animal that returns repeatedly becomes recognizable. People learn which one waits, which one steals, which one growls, and which one follows without approaching too closely. Recognition changes the calculation. Food is no longer thrown toward wolves in general. It is given to a particular animal whose behavior has become predictable. The canid rises when the group moves and follows at a distance, then closer. It begins to associate certain voices, gestures, and individuals with food or safety. If it is injured, young, or threatened by other wolves, humans may intervene not necessarily from affection, but because losing a familiar animal also means losing the time already invested in it. Young animals could deepen the relationship. A pup raised near human bodies, sounds, and movement would experience people not only as competitors, but as part of its social environment. Humans, in turn, would encounter the animal before its fear and hunting behavior were fully developed. That did not guarantee trust. Many such attempts may have failed, but each surviving generation would make the next relationship easier to maintain. If the relationship persisted, the animal may eventually have begun to influence decisions. It had to be fed, watched, moved, restrained, protected, or included. Its warning posture could draw human attention. Its absence could be noticed. This is the social meaning of domestication. It deepens when the group starts organizing part of its life around the animal. We cannot know what Ice Age people called these canids or what they believed about them. But the evidence from later Paleolithic dogs suggests that some had crossed a crucial boundary. They were no longer merely exploiting human space. They had become participants in it. Yet participation did not make the relationship equal, gentle, or voluntary. The same process that created belonging also gave humans power over which animals were allowed to survive. Belonging had a cost, and the animal did not choose all of it. One possible route into domestication begins not with scavenging adults, but with captured pups. Hunter-gatherers may have taken very young wolves from dens, raised them near people, and discovered that a few could form unusually strong bonds. Some may have followed camps for a season. Others may have escaped when mature, become dangerous, or returned to wild packs. The failures would leave almost no archaeological trace. Animals that tolerated handling could be fed and protected. Those that attacked, fled, or threatened children could be driven away or killed. Even without a breeding plan, humans would influence which canids survived near them and which had opportunities to reproduce. Selection could therefore arise from affection, usefulness, fear, and violence at the same time. This human-initiated model competes with the idea that wolves largely domesticated themselves by approaching camps, and neither has been proven as the single beginning. Different groups may have captured pups, while free-ranging wolves continued to exploit human kills. The two pathways could have overlapped, failed repeatedly, and changed across places and generations. Nor was domestication a one-way march toward gentleness. Dogs and wolves continued to interbreed. Useful animals could still be restrained, exchanged, abandoned, or killed. Entry into the human social world did not grant equality. It placed reproduction, movement, food, and survival increasingly under human influence. That is the uncomfortable core of the relationship. Care made closeness possible. Control made it heritable. After thousands of generations of that uneven partnership, what remains inside the dog sleeping beside us? The ancient experiment is still visible in a modern room. A dog hears something beyond the door and lifts its head before the human beside it notices. When the sound fades, the animal does not simply return to sleep. It looks toward the person, checking the face, posture, and voice of a social partner. Young dogs can use human pointing gestures with little training. Compared with similarly aged wolf puppies raised intensively around people, they are generally more likely to approach humans, make eye contact, and treat a human gesture as useful information. When faced with an impossible task, many dogs also look back toward a nearby person. That gaze is sometimes described as help-seeking, although experience, training, persistence, and the testing situation all affect the response. Even the act of looking may help maintain the bond. One influential experiment linked longer mutual gaze between dogs and their owners, with increased oxytocin in both, a pattern not observed in the hand-raised wolves tested. But these findings do not reveal what happened beside the first Ice Age camps. A modern dog carries both a long history of selection and a lifetime of experience with people. We cannot project its behavior unchanged into a Pleistocene wolf. What the modern animal shows is the direction of the transformation. The descendant of a predator once required to monitor humans as a threat now watches human eyes, hands, and voices for guidance. Its social world has been reorganized around another species. Tonight, when a dog raises its head and looks to a person before deciding what to do, the oldest part of the partnership becomes briefly visible. But the final question remains, who invited whom into the light? The answer may be hidden in what did not happen. A wolf approached a human camp, and no stone was thrown. It returned, and no spear followed. A piece of meat remained beyond the sleeping place. A pup was not killed. An animal followed when the group moved, and someone allowed it to continue. None of these moments created the dog by itself. Food may have created the first opportunity for contact. Social intelligence made cooperation possible. Repeated contact allowed humans and canids to recognize individuals, predict behavior, and invest in relationships that had once been too dangerous. Selection then preserved the animals most able to remain near people, and the people most willing to keep them there. The process was practical, emotional, and unequal. It included protection and control, usefulness and attachment, failed experiments, and lost lineages. It did not happen everywhere or all at once. There may never have been a first human who understood what was beginning. There may never have been a single wolf that crossed a permanent line. The boundary moved through thousands of small decisions made by both species. Beyond the fire, the animal was once a competitor, a scavenger, and a threat. Beside the fire, its descendant became a watcher, a traveler, and eventually a member of the human world. The first dog may have begun not when a wolf entered the light, but when neither species forced the other back into the dark.